One of them wanted to be the security guy. He claimed he was a security guy.
Welcome to a domestic, albeit not violent version of Security Guy Radio. www.securityguyradio.com. Visit our new website. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Welcome, Mr. Bristow.
Hello. How are you?
That's it.
Tally-ho.
Tally-ho. Oh, today we're going to continue our conversation that we had on our other episode you may have missed with Dr. Steve Albrecht. We're going to talk about domestic violence in the workplace. Now, this is something that most people still don't get. And I've been to all kinds of people that were my clients that think it's a private matter. They think it's nobody's business if you come into work with a black eye and we shouldn't talk about it. And what they forget, remember we learned from Pat Prince, that 40% of all workplace violence issues stem from domestic violence issues. The husband coming back, shooting up the place because he's pissed at his wife and that. So what I find interesting is there's things like lack of restraining order policies, not requiring employees to file the restraining order that the court says, hey, you got to give a copy to your employer, right? And they don't.
Yeah.
Because there's embarrassment, there's social stigma, there's those kind of things. And I think it's really important that if you're a company that I was just at recently, you have as much as 65 or 70% female employees, you're going to have a higher incidence of workplace violence, potentially, if 40% is related to domestic violence, because you're going to have a higher appearance of domestic violence.
Have you found that, what I've found, especially since we've been out on a consulting sort of area, is that it also depends on the type of company. I've noticed that family-owned businesses seem to want to ignore this problem more than most corporations. Although they may be very large, they still don't really want to face it, and I think it's because they can't. It's that social stigma.
Yeah, I think so.
Running in.
Well, I think there's a misconception of what they think the employees' rights are,
what
the law says. I have to be confidential with these employees, and I can't tell people about that. But there's I don't think there's any confidentiality in violence in the workplace. If you know your husband's going to come down here and shoot the place up.
Yeah.
Now, you had a case at Fox we talked about several shows ago where there was something similar. Tell us about that one.
This was you're referring to the woman that came into my office and said that she had been shot 6 times about 15 years previously.
Right.
And I don't think I've told you about this one. But so this woman comes into the office. She says, and she was in my building as well. I'd known her for several years. Very petite, nice woman. She said, my husband shot me, I believe it was 6 or 7 times about 15 years ago, and he's been in prison, and he's just called me and said he's going to come down and kill me. Now, I'm thinking, I don't know, it sounds a bit far-fetched, So anyway, I did a quick bit of checking. Sure enough, this had happened, and he had been released that day, and from one of the prisons up in past Palmdale. So I got hold of the PD. We put a notice out on him, etc. And he was actually arrested the next day in Lancaster, I think it was. And he had actually sexually assaulted a woman that he'd shacked up with that night. But in the car, he had several weapons and a picture of his wife, where she was working, etc., etc. So I've absolutely no doubt he was on his way down to the building I was actually in, which was off of the studio, to kill her. I mean, there was absolutely no doubt about it.
Yeah.
Very, very dangerous stuff. And that would have happened pretty fast as well.
Well, it's fortunate that we have smarter people than us to talk about these things.
Absolutely.
And our guest tonight on our 7 o'clock show is Dr. Steve Albrecht, PHR, which stands for
Professional and Human Resources.
Professional and Human Resources, CPP.
Certified Protection Professional.
And BCC.
Board Certified Coach.
Unbelievable.
That's all the stuff my mom makes me say.
But what's more interesting is that Dr. Albrecht wrote a book called Ticking Bombs, Defusing Violence in the Workplace. It was one of the first businesses about this. One of the first books on workplace violence, right?
Yep.
Back in the day.
When was that?
94.
94, yeah. People weren't even talking about that back then.
Interviewed a double murderer in that book. Workplace double murderer.
So you're a trainer, speaker, consultant. You're really internationally known for these high-risk areas in HR. I always want to give people's websites. So how should we get a hold of you so people can log in?
DrSteveAlbrecht.com, ALBRECHT.com.
And you're a former police officer, which is really kind of...
Worked for the City of San Diego PD. I was in the domestic violence unit, handled 1,500 cases in 6 years. So I have a good feel for this issue as a crossover concern from home to work. I was a DV detective for about 5 minutes before I realized most domestic violence victims work. And a lot of these cases cross over, and that becomes problematic.
Right. So give us your best practice on this. Let's hear let's hear your knowledge, because I think a lot of people miss this. I've known at the studios we had people that came to work with black eyes. We knew what was going on. We had people break into tears after they got a phone call. We all knew what was happening.
I mean,
right?
the good thing, we did have a pretty good program.
We did, but the question is how much
still lost.
How much do you miss, right?
Yeah.
But both of you brought up really great points in terms of are we missing some things? And here's the bottom line. When do we have the right to get involved in an employee's personal life? And the answer is when it affects work. So if someone manages to keep their domestic violence situation under wraps, which is difficult, then we don't have the right as an employer to become invasively involved. However, as you well know from your experiences, they oftentimes either reach out for help or they come in and they show the signs. Or their spouse or partner or ex-spouse or ex-partner's behavior becomes problematic to the organization when the guy shows up, calls, tries to come on the property. And Chuck, you brought up a great point. A lot of organizations have restraining order language in their policies. In training classes, I always say, look, if you have a restraining order against your boyfriend, Rotten Johnny, and there's a chance he's going to come to this facility and violate the order, you got to tell us. And people say, well, what can you do? Well, we can come up with a safety plan. We can work with law enforcement to find out whether the restraining order has been served and if it's valid, and in which case can we move you to a new facility, move you to another building, change your shift, change your work hours, send you home temporarily. There's lots of answers that we may come up with if we know about the situation.
Do you think restraining orders are effective or ineffective?
This is a huge controversy. When I was in the cops, and you guys know this too from your work, we were kind of pro-restraining order back in the old days. Get a restraining order was sort of the watchword for these types of situations. Well, what we discovered through research and training and also from watching these people get killed is many times the restraining order is the triggering event for the perpetrator that puts him over the top.
Too much stress.
I always say when people from clients ask me, my answer is always it depends. And I think we get good training from this from some of the thought leaders in the workplace violence and domestic violence world, like Gavin DeBecker. DeBecker will say sometimes when you engage with these perpetrators, you enrage them. So I always say, do we need a restraining order? And this could be for either a workplace violence termination issue or a domestic violence issue. Does it make the situation worse by getting one? I'll give you a parallel is the classic cease and desist letter. The organization will send the suspect a cease and desist letter. If you come onto the property, if you contact this victim, if you try to email her, we will come after you with all possible legal means, and then we don't. So he calls and shows up, and then we don't have him arrested, we don't do anything, and then we write him another letter. So the restraining order, the controversy for the restraining order from my side is the victim oftentimes falls down in terms of helping us enforce it. The cops do their part. They'll show up and arrest the guy. Right. The organization will do their part. They'll notify the police. They'll protect her. But she'll go 5 or 6 or 10 or 50 times that he violates the order before she tells us.
Yeah. Well, the psychological factor there is she's saving her life by doing that sometimes. In other words, if she doesn't go along with the plan and take his phone calls and, let him follow around or vent or something, a lot of women tell me that they do that because it keeps them alive for that period of time till they're out of the situation.
Yeah, the only concern there is then who has the power. Then the suspect has the power over them. And I understand the emotionality of that. But he has the power over them if she says, I'm going to go along with his demands, whether it's sexual or physical contact or meeting him. He has the power over her in those situations.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think, if the victim does that, it basically voids that restraining order, because once you get in front of the judge and you say, you know what, he violated this 10 times.
Well, I think it might
you're done,
it might affect the penalty phase. But if I'm a cop, I got a restraining order, it's valid, I'm arresting you.
Exactly.
That solves my problem.
I never disagree with Paul Bristow ever, but I'm going to have to disagree with Paul Bristow because
I said correct me if I'm wrong.
The dynamic there is The judge, as you said, Chuck, the judge told him not to violate the order.
Yeah.
So if he says, baby, I've got Starbucks and bagels, let's meet in the parking lot. And she says, no, I have a restraining order. He says, oh, I promise I'll be on my best behavior. She goes out and meets him in the parking lot. Something happens. She runs in and calls the cops. The cops show up, as you said, Chuck, and arrest the guy, or should.
Yeah, it's against him, not
Right,
her,
so-
or her, not him.
So if she wants to go back and say, I no longer want the restraining order, different story, but he's being restrained by the judge, by the court, rather than her.
So I kind of lean, 51% towards restraining orders. I think we ought to get them on file. I think we ought to make a record. I'm not saying we need to serve him, though. And I'm not saying we need to let the perpetrator know that he's on a restraining order. But you should have that ready, so in a dire situation, you can pull it out and say, you're now served, and now the cops, some clever cop that knows how to write a report could say, well, they served him right in front of me, and I found him on the property, and I arrested him.
Well,
and again, legally it's a mechanism, but it can't be absolutely an agitator to set the guy off. And you got to be very careful how you use it. I agree with you
know,
and Gavin
one of
on
the
that.
problems I see, one stat I did see at some point, and I think this actually might have come out from Reed, was that mutual restraining orders are 100% effective, which is a really interesting
surprising.
statistic.
They are effective because the perpetrator says, see, now she can't bother me as well, as if that's what
Right.
she was going to do. But back to the restraining order piece, I always say they work really well for good rule followers. And if the guy's not a good rule follower, or some of these guys are not good rule followers in life in general, it's not going to work.
Well, you wouldn't get a restraining order against him if he was a rule follower.
But
in the
sometimes,
first place.
but I disagree, because sometimes you get a guy who goes, okay, I've reached my limit. I understand this is a boundary, and he puts the brakes on because he's afraid of the rules, which is could be arrested, could be fired, could be this, could be that. The guy that's a maniac and doesn't follow any rules is not going to work.
One of the things that always worried me about restraining orders was that notice before a TRO. So you're going to get your TRO, and then you got to give him, I know Santa Monica used to be 24 hours, I think it was, notice that you was going to go down and get the TRO.
Oh, so he can respond to
so
it.
that he could respond, or so that he could turn up.
So he can
and
kill you
call.
before he
That
violates your restraining order.
That always concerned
No,
me,
it's true. Yeah.
That's what, as you both suggested, that's why the emotionality of restraining orders is not to be taken lightly.
Yeah.
But in the old days of sort of, the police response was
just
to
gonna
get
get
one,
one.
and
Yeah.
or the
Yeah.
corporate responses to get one is not always the best.
Well, I remember as I was ending my career, or as my chief was ending my career, as I like to put it, I think
You don't have to leave, but you can't come back here. Is that it?
something like that. I started a police association. That'll do it. I think we had the field, temporary emergency restraining orders, or whatever they call them, were just coming in.
EPO.
EPO. I found those very effective
Right.
because now I don't have to tell Sally to go down to the court. She's not going to do it anyway.
Correct.
We can just write this guy one and say, "Here you go, pal," and you come back, and that did help because when you have the authority of the police officer behind the piece of paper, and I'm giving you a command and I'm signing the paper, I think that is more effective than the judge. And it's a civil matter. I don't care, and people can respond negatively to them.
And it gives them 72 hours to decide whether she wants to go out and get the order, actually.
Right. Well, I think we got restraining orders handled on that one. So
the answer there is it depends.
It depends.
it depends.
Yeah.
Big
right.
time.
Which
it
is a good
depends.
consulting answer
Yeah.
on almost anything I do.
Can we
anyway.
compel an employer? Can we compel an employee to tell us about restraining orders? I say yes. Here's why. In most cases, I believe they're public record. So why could I not either look the record up myself and say, "Hey, Steve, you got a restraining order. You didn't tell me about it. Now I got a problem. Tell me what's going on."
That's correct.
From what I've found, a lot of employees don't even realize that the company would assist them with this stuff. That's half the problem. It's a lot of them would come forward if they knew.
Well, the social.
But they just assume that the company doesn't want to know.
No, I think it's because the social stigma, being embarrassed and being
Yeah.
a victim and being perceived that way.
But if the company hasn't put it out there that they're concerned and that they're going to keep it quiet, they're going to keep it
that's true.
confidential,
Yeah.
then that employee isn't going to come forward.
Well,
with
that
this
goes back
problem.
to a comprehensive workplace violence
Yeah.
policy to begin with, which can include domestic violence pieces.
And there's a separate part of that, back to Paul's part about the organization, which is now, and this is not new, but companies can get also a workplace harassment order, which says, and this is good for larger facilities, not only, let's say we have the TRO order in place, not only can you not bother, pester, call, annoy, touch, harass this employee, you can't do it for any employee.
Yeah,
So-
that's
so
like a corporate restraining order.
Right.
They call
So
it.
yeah, corporate
Yeah.
restraining order. I think it's 527 of the Civil Code, which is a workplace harassment order, which is great for college campuses, large facilities, where the guy says, "Hey, I can sit in the parking lot across the street and watch her with binoculars, or I can pester her coworkers." The answer is no, you can't. Now, we've restrained you for the entire organization.
I've advised a lot of companies on that, and they had no idea that existed.
Right.
They thought it was just an individual thing. which is, I think that's a super powerful tool.
Because then the guy says, I'm not bothering her, I'm bothering these other people. And you say, great, we're going to come after you for bothering any employee in our organization.
Right, and then, of course, so they could always arrest for trespassing, but that's complicated because you have to give a warning on trespassing, right? So it just depends on how they look at. Brian, what we got 30 seconds there. Look at how intuitive
That's
my
good, 'cause
sense
I was
of.
just going to ask a really long question.
All right, let's hold that. Let's hold that thought. We're going to come back, and we're going to talk about, Steve, a new law, January this year. You're going to be very surprised, ladies and gentlemen, about this new law. It's about time. Why they didn't have it 10 years ago, I'm not sure. But there are tools we can use to help make the workplace safer. Back in a minute on Security Guy Radio. Welcome back to SecurityGuyRadio.com. We should start saying that all the time now,
Yes,
SecurityGuyRadio.com.
www.
Please go to the website. Make my clicks go up. Back with Dr.
Now
Steve
we like
Albrecht,
clicks.
talking about domestic violence in the workplace, and Steve is our expert in this matter. At the break, we were talking about a law. Now, I remember, back in the day, there were certain laws that allowed employers to intervene and help people with domestic violence. If you got bonked in the head, you could take family leave or family medical leave. There's accommodations that could be met, frankly, under OSHA or, just depends. But there's now an affirmative law, which is kind of akin to when we were young cops and we went to domestic violence. We couldn't arrest somebody if the wife didn't say, I want to prosecute it. Remember that? That was kind of crazy. And now we have an affirmative duty to take reports and act as police officers. But now in the workplace, we have a tool that we can do to use. And what is that?
In California, we have Senate Bill 400, which just passed and was enacted January 1st, which says organizations, when notified, I think the cutoff is 50 or more employees, when notified of a domestic violence situation involving an employee, they must take reasonable accommodation.
Must,
including time off to go to a court hearing or to get access to counseling or exposure to employee assistance program. And we have to discuss, as part of the statute, a safety plan for the employee at work.
So I wonder why it was less than 50.
Financial burden, I think.
50 or more employees is usually, I think ADA is the same way. 50 or more employees is when ADA kicks in.
But if you look at the Seal Beach shooting, how many employees there? There was only
at this beauty salon.
Yeah,
biggest mass murder in the history of Orange County.
Well, that's the Affordable Care Act. It's 50 or more employees.
Yeah, I know. It just doesn't make sense.
Well, it's financial burden. They think
but
you're rich if you have 50 employees. They think you're part of the 1%ers or something. You barely actually make any money. All right, so we have an affirmative duty in the law on this, which is kind of unusual. Not too many affirmative duties. So let's talk about how an employer can and should respond to these issues.
So the crossroads is, we have a duty to respond even though it's a confidential issue if it affects the safety of other employees. And so I found in these situations, and this is my experience working a lot with human resources, a lot of HR tends to be staffed with females that have good sensitivity to this concern. They can have the conversation with a female employee, whereas a male manager may have some trepidation or be uncomfortable. So human resources is probably the stepping stone for that. But if you look at the organization, we have things like employee assistance program, counseling. There's offsite. And I brought offsite EAP people to work to meet with the victim during lunch hour. And you say, well, why would you do that? Well, if we say go to EAP counseling after work, she says, I'm afraid my boyfriend will beat me or kill me if I'm not home at 5:15. She won't go.
And for my mother, EAP stands for?
Employee Assistance Program.
All right, very good.
So
Get that, Mom? Okay,
we'll
good.
We'll bring the counselors in to meet with the victim employee there in that environment and say, let's get you some help. There's National Domestic Violence Hotline, which I think the last four is SAFE, S-A-F-E.
Yeah.
I can't remember what the first letters are, but if you put National DV Hotline in, it'll pop up, and there's access to that as well as a resource. Lots of community-based resource programs in cities and counties for domestic violence help as well.
How do they handle the confidentiality part? It's a tough one. We've had this in every place I've worked. You know that Billy Bob is coming down to hurt his wife or girlfriend or whatever it is. So we have to put out, we called it a clearance alert, right? Or a BOLO, whatever you want to call it. and you have to let everybody know that Billy Bob's coming down and be on the lookout and call us if he's there. But then we couldn't always put underneath his photograph why,
Right.
which does two things. I now have put the guard in jeopardy because now he is not ready to respond to a potentially violent act. He's just supposed to hope that this guy doesn't come and shoot him first, then shoot his wife. I was never clear on the laws there. I think that if you're coming down to do something violent, I think you lose your privacy rights, and I think we should be able to tell people about that. How does that law handle that?
I agree, because the way I understood it, and Paul, you can echo in on this too, is oftentimes we had to tell the gatekeepers, receptionists, security, people that were at the access control points, don't let this guy into the building. We can't tell you why, which is ridiculous.
But don't tell the other employees.
Right.
And I always found a way to tell the other employees because I want to tell everybody sitting next to the victim, the potential victim, be on the lookout and help her out. Let us know.
Yeah, that's a difficult conversation because we're back to the embarrassment and things. And so you look and you say, why wouldn't somebody logically reach out for help in a situation where they're fearful of being killed at work? And the answer is there's a lot of emotions, a lot of fears. And you all know from your experience, I mean, these victims sometimes go back to these suspects even after a significant violent incident. And
More
so
often.
you say, how do we school them to the idea that we're trying to save their lives, not just now, but into the future?
So it sounds like the law gets them halfway down the road to helping. In other words, they're taking some steps to counsel them, let them know what's going on. Doesn't sound like there's much on the security side of it for the employer. We have the company restraining order we talked about. They can, of course, engage that. But I'm not sure how this is going to help the employee beyond personally. How's it helping the organization? I get that part.
Yeah, the part of the statute that I think is interesting is the necessary conversation about the safety plan. So the safety plan says we're not going to necessarily talk about what you do at home, but when you're here, let's have you park over here. Let's have you get an escort into the facility. Let's have you, we're moving you to a new facility temporarily, or changing your hours, or changing your location, or changing your telephone. Here we're taking some active steps towards helping her manage that situation instead of just saying, well, I hope it works out for you.
So does it actually put an onus on the employer to provide security for this person?
It says safety plan. Should
Individual
discuss,
safety
should
plan?
discuss
Safety
a safety plan
plan
for the organization, for the employee in the organization.
But what about sort of, you talk about an escort. I mean, is that a safety plan is a little bit different from actually providing security?
Oh, that's true.
I think the legislators in their infinite wisdom have went to the generic, safety plan, which is to say more than just notify the victim. Yeah, we're here for you. Here's the reason why this law exists is in days of old, and even as recently as last year, victims of domestic violence would be terminated for bringing this situation to the attention of management.
I've seen that.
Many people have seen that, yeah.
They have two problems. One, still got bad boyfriend, bad husband, could be threatening, dangerous, murderous guy, and now no job.
Yeah.
All right, so it sounds like it's an individual safety plan as each incident presents itself to the company.
And I think in terms of due diligence, the organization would say, look, this is not something we want to get involved with. This is not something we like to get involved with, but it's here. We have to. As a result, we're going to talk about protecting you as best as we can when you're here. We'll provide you some resources that maybe you don't know exist: employee assistance, national domestic violence counseling, help, support, law enforcement contact, security if that's a function in the organization, to try to give more resources for somebody who may have a lot of tunnel vision for this issue.
In SB 400, in the safety plan, does it note there, having not read it, and I'm assuming you have.
I have.
Does it actually note in there what the safety plan consists of?
Yeah, it's if we're back to the sort of generic, do the best you can, employers. We're trying to do the best we can as a legislative body to say we're put on notice about this issue. A San Diego case, as a matter of fact, a woman worked as a school teacher at a church school. Her boyfriend, her husband, threatened her. She was terminated as a result. So I understand the logic behind the statute. I think it needs to exist. The struggle is how much is enough for the employer, and how much is, well, we gave you a brochure, we told you about EAP, and then something horrible happened. What's the protection for the employer?
Well, it's going to be interesting once the first lawsuit comes through for failing to adhere to SB 400 and how.
What's the standard for it? Yeah, what's the standard of care?
I mean, what expert witness is going to say what? I mean, it's going to be very interesting to see the first company that has to protect themselves against the lawsuit.
So if we're advising an employer on how to put this in place, I might say, tell me if I'm wrong, I might say your individual safety plan for individual incidents should parallel your company policy. It should be essentially the same thing. I'm not sure you can have a higher standard of care to protect
That's a good point.
Paul Bristow because you had you have a crazy wife, because you could have a crazy wife that we don't know about that isn't crazy. And if the standard's lower on your side of it, and something happens and these employees are affected because you didn't tell us, I think it's I would just advise that the policies are consistent, I think, the plans.
And I think the language in the statute also says, if I understand it as from looking at it, is there's not a duty of absolute protection from the organization. You provide the information to the employee. If they deviate from good standard security advice, that's not our liability.
So it really just says that you've got to provide information and a plan, not that you've got to provide. And I know I said this before, but you as an employer, you don't have to provide physical measures.
Yes.
You know, I'm in a very
Interesting.
indecisive mood this Monday. I'm retracting my previous position on this. I think I said at the break this is a really good law. I think this is a bad law now.
Yeah, I'm
Well,
not
it's vague.
impressed, I must say.
It's vague. I mean, they're trying. I see what they're trying to do, but if we don't have an affirmative duty to put a security guard, we're doing the same thing as. Remember, we used to hire guards. How many pamphlets do we have to pass out during hiring at the company that should go unnamed? Right.
I think let's back up for a second. The primary, in my understanding, the primary reason for the law is to say we're not firing DV victims when they bring it to our
That's fair.
attention.
That's
Yeah,
a
that's
great
the
part of the law.
primary
That's
issue.
the best part of the law.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so then why put all the other things of passing out brochures and pamphlets and so on? If I'm not really giving her some physical protection, I'm giving her a false sense, and I could see a lawsuit where I've given you a false sense that I'm protecting you if the law is vague on it. And, well, we never said we're giving you a security guard to take you to the parking lot every day. We can't afford that, and something happens in the parking lot.
Well, and then the other side is, how do you know that person giving the advice actually knows what the hell they're talking about?
Oh, is there anything
does
in the
it
code
say
that says that?
they've got to bring
Yeah.
somebody in?
I think the biggest part of the statute is to say, in previous stigma related to this issue, we punish the victim. So the legislator's attempt is to say we're not punishing the victim for bringing this attention to our attention, or we discovered it ourselves. So that's I think that's 80% of the issue is not getting fired.
Which is good.
And the reasonable accommodation piece is significant, but the first part is not to get fired. We're not going to fire people for bringing this to our attention, because that is a standard for some employers to say, I want to get rid of this problem. I'll get rid of it by getting rid of the
as I say, I've
employee.
actually seen that going on, which is awful.
Oh, I know several
going
people that
through
were
this-
fired
through
from
this problem.
25-year careers because of they weren't fired for that, by the way. Quote.
Yeah.
It was something else, right? There's the music. So after the break, let's talk about what we can do to make the workplace safer. This is a step to prevent from firing people, which is great, but let's come up with some solutions to make your workplace a safer environment. Back in a minute on Security Guy Radio. That's securityguyradio.com. Welcome back to securityguyradio.com. It's our new brand now. Make sure you visit the website, securityguyradio.com.
For your mum.
www for my mom. My mom is that?
Your mum.
My mom is Irish, not British. I'm sorry, we're not going to use that term. It's ma and da for our Irish vernacular. All right, now you.
Well, I
since
wanted to step back a little bit.
but since I'm talking too much because I'm Irish, it's a genetic thing. I'd like my British counterpart here to ask some
The
questions. Go ahead.
Blarney stuff.
The Blarney Stone has got me today.
I'm amazed you guys can be in the same room together.
Well, it's been
it gets
15,
interesting.
18 years, I think, something like that. Mr. Bristow, proceed. I beg your pardon.
So I wanted to step back a little bit because when we first started, we talked a little bit. You talked a little bit about the signs of DV, and can you build on that a little bit, and so people know what we're talking about?
I think there's some obvious things, and then there's some covert things. And the obvious things is the perpetrator shows up in the lobby, he threatens the victim over the telephone. There's a teary conversation. She hangs up afraid. He tries to make access into the facility, coming in through the back door, or he knows an employee that works there and they let him into the facility. Those are more obvious. I think the struggle is we look at performance and productivity of the employee and say, what's affecting this person who normally shows up on time but shows up 15 minutes late? I had a case with an aerospace manufacturer where the woman literally put her lipstick on her forehead because she was so stressed and so out of touch with what was going on and so fearful that she put her lipstick on her forehead. No one in the organization said anything to her, even though she looked like a clown, because they were thinking, well, maybe that's what she wants to do, and we're too embarrassed to confront her.
Right.
Yeah.
That's where it takes some courage with a capital C for an employee, a coworker, to say, what's going on with you?
Yeah.
This is not like you. You're a frazzled mess. The phone rings, you jump 100 feet. You stay at your desk, you leave, you know, what's going on with you? What can I do to help you? And that's where the folks that are in those situations have to have the courage on their part as the victim and say, I need some help.
Do you see a lot of people turning up with, you know, the black eyes and bruises and that type of thing, or is that sort of stuff really hidden?
I think a lot of these perpetrators are pretty good at inflicting damage that doesn't show up.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the emotional, but the physical. That's the twist marks. That's the wounds that are covered by the victim's clothing and things like that. But we see women, you know, putting on the makeup to cover those things. I mean, they can be pretty clever and to say, I don't want to draw attention to this situation. When, you know, the paradox is we can help you if we know, we can't help you if we don't know.
So let's talk about that. Let's put that in the prevention category. What can an employer do to prevent something from rising to a workplace issue? What can they require of an employee to let them know about things like this?
Think of all the things that we have to tell employees about. Here's our earthquake policy. Here's our time card policy. Here's how you get into the facility after hours. Here's the alarm codes or whatever we give people. We're especially driven by HR, we're always in kind of an information providing sort of a perspective. So this becomes one of those issues. Here's how to sign up for the company softball team. Next week we're going to talk about, you know what, we have an employee assistance program, EAP provider, counselor. By the way, here's a National Domestic Violence hotline on a brochure here that we leave those laying around. So it's all part of an ongoing conversation about a lot of employee behavior issues on and off the job that we help employees with education. So part of it is to say, you know what, we're familiar with the fact that this thing shows up in organizations. We're not here to pry into your personal life, but oh, by the way, we have some resources maybe you didn't know about. Next week we talk about something different.
Do you support mandatory reporting policies?
I do, because we can't fix what we don't know about. So I remember a case when I was writing the Ticking Bombs book. We started working on it about 92. There was a case in the Auto Club, AAA, in San Diego. I think it was at the La Mesa facility. Woman was working at her desk. Ex-husband shows up. She has a restraining order against him. He shoots and kills her at the facility. The surviving family sued Auto Club and said, you know what, you didn't protect this woman. And what was their defense?
No policy?
What restraining order? We didn't know there was a restraining order.
Oh,
and the way they succeeded in court is that, and this is pretty progressive for 1992, they said if we had known about this, we would have moved her to a new Auto Club facility. We would have activated, you know, this policy here. We would have brought in private security. We would have done these things. We didn't know about it if we couldn't respond because we weren't told about it. They prevailed in court.
Well, I think that's reasonable.
Right.
That makes sense.
Right.
I always had one-page workplace violence policies, literally. And it said, you know, you have an affirmative duty as an employee to report violent issues against you, absent any medical confidentiality. I don't need to know that. I don't need to know any medical record about it. And failure to do so is going to result in termination. And then I listed about 10 things that were threats, from veiled to direct. I'll be back, Arnold Schwarzenegger's statement, right down to I'm going to kill you, ha, ha, ha. And remember that? We terminated people for that.
Yeah.
So we had a case once where there was 2 male guards, and they worked in the same facility. And at the change of each shift, one guard would throw the other guard a gang sign. And one was saying he was a blood, one was saying he was a crypt. And I called them both in and I said, you guys are fired. And they said, oh, I can't fire me for that. I said, yeah, you didn't report that he's throwing signs at you, and you didn't report that he's throwing signs back. And you don't go throwing signs on turf. It's a threat of violence. It's not even a veiled threat in that culture. It's a direct threat.
Not part of the passed down procedures for us here.
Right. So that's not what you do as a guard. We don't check in as a blood or a crypt, right? And you know, they didn't sustain their claim on that.
Yeah.
Because I just felt
You never
that
lost claims.
I really didn't lose too many claims. Yeah, that's true. And I thought that was a good way to do it, right? And then, of course, if they came in for an investigation, this is another tip. You probably know this. If I can't get them on the underlying issue, what do you get them for? Lying. Did you do it? Nope. Is that you on videotape doing it? Well, yeah, you're fired for lying.
That's what I would call blindsided HR, which means get them from the blind side.
You know what? In California, you can still fire somebody for lying. You may not be able to fire them for what they did, actually, but you can still fire them for lying. So I'm a big proponent of affirmative, duty, things like that. And what I find is that when you do that, it kind of makes an open door policy, and it makes you more receptive as the boss or more friendly as the boss, and people feel more comfortable that if it's in paper, they feel like they're more comfortable to talk about it because they're going to be protected. And the other thing that happens is you get, we know this as cops interviewing witnesses, there's the witness that won't say a thing until you ask them. And then all of a sudden they go blah, 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 because it's an agenda-driven witness, right?
Or they wait till after the incident. Then they're the fountain of information.
Then they know all about it. They told you all about it, right? But with having an affirmative policy like that, I found it that we did have one employee that came out. There was an employee that wanted to be covered by a piece of paper that said, you know, I'm protected from this. And the guard that actually reported these two other guards throwing signs, she was actually afraid for her life. She thought they were going to come back and, bust a cap on her because, we kept her confidential on that, and it worked. So I think that's a powerful tool to start with that kind of thing. And it just lets employees feel like the company cares, by the way. And if you don't have a policy, what are they going to do?
And here's a dynamic in the conversation which we haven't brought up is the domestic violence victim who now starts dating a new boyfriend in the organization. So now we have ex-boyfriend or ex-husband, and he discovers that new boyfriend works there. And so we have this love triangle thing, and you know from your experience, these end up oftentimes in homicides and suicides. So there's a significant concern there to the safety of a lot of people. That brings up a whole discussion as to whether or not we can get involved from a human resources perspective or security perspective if employees are dating each other, and we know about this, love triangle piece here.
So I'm a little rusty on those. We had some no dating policies, I thought, at Fox. Was there something vague on that?
No, not
or you had to
really.
tell people about it?
We had some pretty severe issues with love triangles at Fox.
Well, we had that
the
love hexagon once, I think. Love hexagon
rhombus.
Or the love pentagon was even more difficult. But
the problem with those cases is you say, well, as a supervisor, do I have the right to get involved in somebody's dating life? And I always say the same thing: if it affects work. So if these people are disappearing for 3 and 4 hours, or kissy face at the water cooler, or there's substantial conflict, and it's funny what our attorney friends have created now are these love contracts. So now a love contract, and I've seen cities who have these, and private sector too, which is you need to sign a piece of paper that says this is a consensual relationship. It's not coercive. There's no promise of promotion or something like that. So now we're documenting that people are having dating relationships.
Well, that's not a bad idea if you're the vice president and that's the secretary. You got to do that because otherwise it's just open to all kinds of things.
Vice president shouldn't be dating the secretary in the first place.
No, that's
can't
right.
control love. Can't stop it.
The courts can.
My lawyer can't.
Well, I think that's when the vice president leaves.
No, I think what I thought about that rule is I think there was a case. So I've worked at a bunch of places where they were in different departments, not a direct report or something like that, and so there was an issue. Although the person was higher ranking in the company, they weren't working in the same department or something like that. But they did get some kind of consensual thing, just so it's on the up and up. That makes sense.
I tell you what I hear from women. I see this in the training environment all the time. I always ask the same question. Ladies, if I can't have you, what's the rest of it? And every woman on the planet says, including my 20-year-old daughter, nobody else can either. If I can't have you, nobody else can either. Those guys are dangerous. So the emotionality of domestic violence, when if I can't have you and you've broken up with me and broke my heart, I'm gonna kill you or hurt you the way you hurt me. Those guys are wicked dangerous.
We didn't really define that at the beginning of the show, domestic violence. There's a legal definition, more or less, but my daughter, who we like to say the one that uses tuition at the house, who's in school right now, she had some
Bank of Dad,
yeah. She had a guy that would never talk to her in class. All right, never talk to her in class. He would look at her once in a while. Second she hit the dorm, boom goes Facebook, boom goes the cell phone, boom goes the text messages, just to a super high level, right? And she'd go back to class next day and say, hey, what's up? And he'd go, what are you talking about? What do you mean, what's up? And, I told her, hey, congratulations, you got a stalker, all right? I classified that as, I told her, to me, it's domestic violence. The guy is pretending he doesn't know you, but by the way, he was making really nasty comments on Facebook and nasty comments on the text about, I can't repeat it. It was pretty vulgar, right? So to me, that's a form of violence, a threat, albeit through electronic transmission. How are we defining domestic violence in the workplace? I mean, living together is an obvious one. Married's an obvious one. Are there other forms we're missing?
I mean, dating relationships, certainly, where there's the threat of violence, emotional violence, or actual physical violence. And we've not talked about same-sex sexual orientation violence. We've not talked about, male victims and female perpetrators. I get this a lot. I wrote a blog for Psychology Today. I write one about every 3 weeks or so. I wrote what I thought was a pretty good blog about warning signs for domestic violence for women who are meeting a guy who wants to get married after the second date and wants to name his kids after your grandma and that type of thing. And I just took a lot of heat for it. Well, I also understand that same-sex sexual orientation, that happens, and also that males can be victims of domestic violence as well with female perpetrators.
Is that more from a psychological point of view?
Well, just statistically, it's a small number, but I do understand that there are male victims.
You got a good story on that when we come back?
I do.
All right. Back in a minute on Security Guy Radio. SecurityGuyRadio.com. Welcome back to Security Guy Radio, SecurityGuyRadio.com. Check out our website, join our mailing list, Twitter us, YouTube us, LinkedIn us, and Facebook us. That's not really the way to say it, is it?
I don't know. There's anything left, is it?
I don't
We do them all.
Oh, we'll come up with something.
Got to be something.
Google Plus is the next one I'm working on.
Oh, yeah.
We're the most reachable security radio show in the world. That's actually true. 26 countries.
We are the only security. Well, I don't know of anybody else out there.
I have to check my Arizona emissions
There may be
insurance before you
somebody,
make
yeah,
broad statements. All right.
Oh, yeah.
What is
Or
it?
as handsome.
Oh, thank you, Brian. There's not as handsome a radio show host as us. Thank you, Brian. That's very nice. Very kind of you to say. Is that domestic violence issue? Is he stalking me right now at work?
I think he's just paid to say that.
I don't know. Be careful.
I wonder what he was doing, making faces through the glass there, actually.
All right, so let's talk about the flip side of domestic violence, because we're always concerned about the females in the workplace, because that is, 85% of domestic violence issues. But we do have the component of the male is the victim, 15% approximately?
I think so. And then, I don't know what the numbers are for same-sex sexual orientation. You have a man who's not come out as gay in the workplace and is in a situation where he's being assaulted by his partner.
Oh, there's two things he doesn't want.
Be a significant concern there.
I dealt with a couple of those at Fox.
Yeah.
Which were pretty, again, well, they're all bad, all these DV
Well, when you were a
cases are
cop,
bad.
you had a male victim story that was
I
pretty...
did, and I told it actually a couple of shows ago. But when I was at Tottenham, which was where all the riots were a couple of years ago, police officer there, and I went to a family, West Indian family, right? Who, typically there's a little bit of macho stuff going on there, and unfortunately the wife had really beaten the husband. And the terrible part of this was when we got it into court, the court was laughing at the male victim. Right, so it was really hard for this guy to come forward, and it was actually pretty brave of him to actually, prosecute. But that was going back a few years. But I don't see that there's too much difference in that society, the way that society actually looks at male victims.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think part of that too is in the workplace. What's the stigma of coming forward as a male amongst your peers? The guys in the warehouse, or it's one thing in your personal life to say I've got to get out of the situation, or I call the police. But in the organization,
can you imagine as a police officer coming forward and
Exactly.
saying I'm getting beaten by my wife?
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a dynamic there that's sort of covert and hidden, but it's certainly an element. Small number, but significant cases.
Okay, so we know, let's do a quick review. We know that in workplace violence cases, approximately 40% of them are domestic violence cases. So you can't really separate them and say that's a different sort of workplace violence. It's going to rise out of a domestic violence situation, often become deadly at work or highly violent. And what was a stat we learned from Pat Prince a while back on the drug part of it? We have about a 10% appearance of people with drugs involved, or maybe it was higher than that, where they're acting out domestic violence. So if we put these kind of components together, give us a thumbnail sketch of what a good workplace violence prevention program looks at. Looks at drug testing, notification of restraining orders, and so on.
Yeah, I think part of the workplace violence overall has a domestic violence component in it, which says we can't address situations we don't know about. So if you're a DV victim, you got to tell us. If you have a restraining order, you have to tell us. So the workplace violence plan overall, pretty broad based, like you said. There's lots of different ways to go in terms of mandatory reporting for employees. One thing we haven't mentioned, which I think is significant to policies, is the concept of bullying. We're hearing a lot of things about this.
Good point.
Right?
One of my colleagues is in San Diego is Catherine Matisse. She wrote a really excellent book on bullying, and her discussion of it is really quite eye-opening because bullying is not always perceived as something you could be fired for. And so we talk about hostile work environment and things like that, but bullying is a form of violence in itself, and that's I like to see that language added into workplace violence policies as well.
We wrote a policy on that. Remember the Fox Network Center?
Yes, oh yeah.
Because we had a group of guards that were going around picking on another group of guards. I think it was because our building was non-union in the broadcast center, and the studio was union, and we actually called it that. I hadn't really thought about that, but it was that you can't tease, bother, harass, all these different words for it, but it does cause us.
No, we had a pretty extensive policy.
It was, and I think you need something like that. In fact, that's almost your basis for workplace violence, because if you cut out that sort of behavior, which is considered often, oh, he just told a joke, just kidding around. And while you're doing that to the victim, steam's coming out of their ears, and then they pop one day, and everybody goes, hey, what happened? I think that's really important.
So I've got kind of a closing story for you that's just shocking and also maybe makes sense too. Woman's dating a guy at work. She breaks up with him. She starts dating a new guy at work, and they're at the house watching TV one day, this is during the day, I think on a Sunday, when the new old boyfriend shows up. The woman runs out of the house and runs to a neighbor's. The new boyfriend gets in his car and drives off. The old boyfriend starts chasing him. The new boyfriend says, I got to think of the safest place I can go. It's not a police station. I'm going to go back to the employer. Employer had security. Employer had fencing. He actually crashes his car through the chain link fence, gets out of the car in the parking lot, runs to the back door of the facility, tries to come inside. The safety director of the organization, a woman, sees the new old boyfriend running towards him with a gun, and she locks the door. He gets shot and killed outside the building by the old boyfriend. Now, this is a good conversation, but short period of time. I think she did the right thing. If she lets that guy in and the bad guy comes in with a gun, then he kills as many people as he wants to, as many bullets as he has. That's a very difficult Sophie's Choice kind of conversation to have in your own head, but she made a split-second decision to say, if this guy comes inside, he kills this employee and anybody else he wants to.
I'm excited with that one.
It's a good decision.
It is a good decision.
Yeah.
Although she probably got sued and lost, or do we know?
But we don't. But can you imagine make that split-second decision, say, I can shelter these folks inside here and watch this domestic violence homicide take place, which she did, which is just horrific.
Yeah. Wow.
No, you're right. That's probably the right decision. That's a good decision. Interesting. So I'm going to put you on the spot now, because when we was driving down here talking over the cell phones, paying attention to the road, obviously.
Not texting.
Not texting. But we
No,
were talking.
I never text when I drive.
So we were talking about the age of victims. Now, I felt that the age of victims was like 35.
Oh, domestic violence.
Domestic
victims.
violence. Yeah. So Chuck thinks.
I thought the higher appearance of domestic violence occurred between 20 and 27 or something like that. I thought it was because they're newlyweds, and I don't believe that if you're married 25 years and you don't beat your wife, you just wake up one day and say, hey, I think I'll beat my wife today. I think you're either that way in the beginning or you're not that way in the beginning. What say you?
Well, if you look at domestic violence, even down into high school, I think 15 to 35-year-old male perpetrators is usually the strongest number of perpetrators. So
perpetrators.
So I'm correct again,
I'm
Mr.
Postal.
Postal.
I'm talking
hang
about
on.
victims.
So with victims,
I meant interaction.
They're usually around that age range as well. So
so we're both right.
So we would agree that crime is a young man's game. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So they psychologically and sort of mentally they de-evolve out of that type of using violence to solve their problems. But in that 15 to 35 range, and especially probably the highest would be 20 to 25.
Okay.
20 to 27
That's
would be
twice I've been wrong today.
would be the most
God,
most
what's
likely.
going on?
And so maybe we're seeing some changes in terms of the evolution of people saying, you know what, we're seeing anti-DV campaigns and anti-assault campaigns in younger generation, which is actually making folks safer. But you guys from your experience and the cops and me too. I mean, we weren't going to a lot of 60-year-old DV cases. I mean, it happened occasionally,
Yeah.
but
Right.
mostly, 20 to 25, 30 years old, it's sort of trailed off at either end of the spectrum.
Actually,
Although,
I think the problem is, I mean, we talked about this before, I think, is getting into the point where you're actually trying to say, yeah, it's going to be this age, because then it takes the other people out of it. And that's the dangerous spot.
yeah, I mean, the oldest one I had, I was a rookie in San Gabriel, and I get a call of it was a domestic violence call, and a wife was calling up complaining about her husband. So I was in training, and it was Officer Butler. Well, he was a good guy, Officer Butler. Very stoic, wasn't affected by anything. So he says, go ahead, Harold, knock on the door, handle it. So knock on the door. Oops, woman opens the door. Yes, ma'am, you called about a domestic violence case? Yes, I did. Okay, what seems to be a problem? Well, it's my husband. I just got tired of listening to him. Okay, well, what would you like us to do? Would you like him, ask him to move or leave? And say, no, he's not going anywhere tonight, but I just want to let you guys know about it. And she says, come on in. So we walk in the door, and I hate laughing about this, but if you don't laugh, you're going to cry, right? We walk in the living room. She sits down to eat dinner, and I look over, and at the edge of the table is the husband, and he has a steak knife in the middle of his head. And he's just laying on the table. And she sits down, keeps eating her dinner. Doesn't blink an eye. And they were about 65, 70 or something like that.
Was he dead as a doornail?
Dead as a doornail. And I said, what happened? And she goes, you know what? I've been married 40 years, and I just got tired of listening to him.
So you can't profile a victim.
No, you can't profile a victim. So beware. Don't talk too much. Well, Steve, thanks for coming in. This, again, was very enlightening, and I think you might say you were wrong 3 times today, because perhaps you should not have come to work if you knew to be wrong twice.
Yeah.
But the Irish got to win once in a while over the British, don't they?
Yeah, I've got to make a mistake.
You got to make once in a while.
Actually,
Steve, give us your website again.
drstevealbrecht.com, or follow me on Twitter at Dr. Steve Albrecht, ALBRECHT. Thanks.
Excellent. All right. Call Steve if you got any
Right.
questions. He's really one of the best in the business. Next week, we'll be talking to a domestic violence
Yes.
victim and their story before the loss came out.
And we must start talking about ATAP.
We will do that.
Association of Threat Assessment
See you next Monday on SecurityGuyRadio.com.